I want to acknowledge the OCLC Research Library Partnership, which both underwrites and inspires our work. Attendees of this webinar are from the OCLC RLP, and I want to thank you for your continued support and input into our work. These are crucial to our success. So I am thrilled to welcome today's presenters, and I will, without any further ado, turn it over to Kate and Carrie to take it away.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see so many people from so many different places, including a couple from the Waterloo there. And we're really excited to talk to you about our kind of relatively new approach to how we work with some STEM students at Waterloo. So the picture on the cover is ironically, and I just realized this, and I should have known this, but this is actually Porter Library at the University of Waterloo, which is the Arts and Humanities Library. Actually, Carrie and I are both at Davis Center Library, which is the STEM library, which is across campus. So this is sort of the kind of gives you an idea of where we work, but I very rarely actually go into this library. So I think we can go to the next slide. We do want to give another land acknowledgement. Carrie and I do want to acknowledge that much of our work in daily living takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. The Waterloo's main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, which is the land that was promised to the Six Nations people. That includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. And really quickly, we just want to say reconciliation is a very complex process that includes making mistakes, learning, apologizing, and moving forward. And we do have some reading from the following sources that can help you deepen your knowledge. So I think our slides will be available. And if they are not, please feel free to email us and they will be included in there. Next slide. So since we're not on camera, which is honestly kind of a delightful way to give a presentation, this is who we are. So I'm Kate Mercer. I'm the liaison librarian for systems design engineering and biomedical engineering. A really quick bit of background on me. My PhD is in pharmacy from the University of Waterloo. And I got my Master of Information from the University of Toronto. And the University of Toronto changed their MLIS degree to a Master of Information the year I got there. So everybody, even in libraries, still asks me what a Master of Information is. It is the library degree. It's just Toronto was doing a change and did that. So Carrie, over to you.
So I'm Carrie Weaver. I'm the Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo. So at a high level, I deal with everything around teaching and learning in the library, including the development of online instruction. And I say at a high level because I'm dealing a lot with sort of these issues on a campus-wide level on behalf of the library. But I still occasionally get to work very deeply in instructing students, and I love that about my work. So I have a doctorate in curriculum and instruction from the University of South Carolina, which I completed a few years ago after I came to Canada, but previously I was in the University of South Carolina system for many years as a librarian and a faculty member. And I got my MLIS what feels like a million years ago now from the University of Rhode Island. So I have been on an adventure with my career and physically as I've moved around in my career in academic librarianship. So we wanted to welcome you today. If we could go ahead and go to the next slide. So today we're going to talk about the pedagogy and theory that we've entitled Critical Evaluation, or CEI, and we will probably refer to it most as CEI because critical evaluation of information is too much of a mouthful for Kate and I to worry about. So this is information literacy, but it's information literacy that's meant to meet users, students, learners where they are and really align with disciplinary needs and uses and practices around information. So the foundation of this is really the idea that what we teach as librarians really has to focus on decision-making processes. We can't be the gatekeepers any longer of where people get information, if we ever were. But we do have an obligation now to really help people figure out how to evaluate and decision make around what information they use. And we will also talk a little bit about disciplinary values and hierarchies, specifically in STEM, and about how the traditional ways that we've thought about and talked about and taught information actually perpetuate systemic biases and don't really align with how people are working with and using information in their work and professional practice anymore. So with that, if we could go to the next slide. So our timeline for the development of CEI in fall 2017, I came to the University of Waterloo, and that was very fortuitous. Kate had started here about a year before, and we sort of instantly found that we were very aligned with one another in our thinking and approach. And at that point, we started conversations, and there was a campus shift happening where the campus was instituting what it was calling first year communication classes, but first year courses that were focused on skills like speaking, writing, research, etc., that are very common across the board, but that was new for Waterloo. And so we began to reframe our approach to teaching in those first year communications classes. By fall 2018, we had refined this, we had standardized the lesson, and we had a cohesive approach across the library to really focus a bit more on evaluation, and that was across disciplines. Certainly with STEM, I should say at the University of Waterloo, we have 6 faculties for our STEM or health focused. So by winter 2019, we were working to really start to incorporate critical appraisal, which I think Kate will mention a bit more, that comes from the health disciplines into STEM information literacy, because information literacy, sort of when you go to a faculty member, especially in STEM, that literacy issue, they think of reading books, and books don't really have a lot to do with STEM information anymore outside of textbooks. So there's this mismatch. Critical appraisal really played a lot more. And that sort of started this transition to CEI and what we're calling it now. And then in the fall, winter of 2019, 2020, we had started the delivery and implementation of this, and also we were working with various collaborators to do data collection and see an assessment and see, was this actually working the way that we thought it was? We knew anecdotally it seemed to be working, but there's a difference between thinking and knowing. So obviously then things changed on us. So by the summer of 2020, we had collaborated on plans to support remote learning and designed integrated interactive modules to be used across faculties to help support the CEI process. And in fall 2020, we worked to gather more data around the impact and effectiveness of doing this in an online learning context. And we will talk a little bit about some of our findings later in the presentation. If we could move on. Great. So information literacy, this thing that we teach. So it's historically focused really on teaching tools and teaching tools that the library offers. And this is often the perspective that librarians come to this teaching with. And that really focuses on what expectations are and what information students need to use in the academic environment. And this is really particular because we know that people use information for a variety of purposes outside of the academic environment. And one of the things that we have a tendency to do with information literacy is sort of ignore that that's happening and set expectations about only what has to happen in the academic environment. And we'll talk about why this puts us at a little bit of a disadvantage, especially in a lot of disciplines. So the other thing is that information literacy, the theory and practice, is really rooted in the library and information science discipline. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that the majority of the students we work with aren't in the LIS discipline. They're studying and trying to understand the norms and conventions of other disciplines in which they are trying to gain some sort of mastery. So we're already at a little bit of a disconnect when we're rooting our practice and idea and approach in a discipline that is not aligned with theirs. So if we could go to the next slide. So Kate's going to take over now and talk a little bit about the STEM disciplines.
Yeah, so again, I got my Master of Information degree, and then I worked for a while in competitive intelligence, and then I got my PhD in pharmacy. And so I very much do come from a kind of STEM background. My master's degree was actually largely focused on data more than anything else. And historically, STEM information literacy focused on presenting information that is inherently kind of boundaried, right? So we tell students, like look at textbooks, look at peer-reviewed journal articles, look at library purchase monographs. And that's very much something that I was raised up in, right? And again, in pharmacy, health related, we're very, very big fans of kind of structured approaches to information. All that said, there's this real big cultural movement in STEM to embrace the fact that many types of information are equally valid. And STEM training is, I'll say cautiously embracing this. And I think that it depends a bit on your discipline, how actively you're embracing it. One example of this is patient-centered research, placing patient-centered voices as equal voices to those of healthcare practitioners or peer-reviewed journals. That's kind of the easiest comparison to make for how each kind of discipline is cautiously going into it. User research and engineering is another area that's cautiously embracing, how do we put different people's voices on par with peer-reviewed journals? How can you expect an Indigenous elder or a patient to structure their knowledge in a way that makes it palatable to the kind of traditional academic context? Again, the other thing that's really interesting about a STEM context is that STEM is notoriously discipline specific. And I say this as somebody, my research has always been, my PhD was multidisciplinary. It was actually between pharmacy, health, and engineering. And it's a wild ride to try and do cross-disciplinary research in these areas. Engineers, scientists are notoriously, kind of hold on to their discipline. And when they seek information, it's within the kind of disciplinary boundaries. Which I think is true for any field. But what's really interesting is that engineers, for example, tend to seek information that is generally actually not tied to the library, right? And I'm not saying they aren't heavy users of library resources. They are. Patent standards, case studies, all of those are in the library. Obviously, they use textbooks. I'm not trying to diminish their use of the library resources. But they do really understand that a lot of their world is kind of practical focused, right? Engineers are practitioners. It's a practice-based degree. So they're going out to get a degree to become professionals. And, in parallel to that, a lot of the information that they're getting is related to those kind of practice-based things. They have journals, they have magazines that they use, they have professional organizations that they give talks at, things like that. And then bench science does tend to be a bit more traditional in type. And by bench science, I mean, chemistry, biology, and they tend to be a bit more traditional. But what's true for all of STEM information around it is that it tends to be very structured and that it builds knowledge on what knowledge was, right? It's that scientific process. Next slide. oh, I was going to say. And so I think what's really interesting in the context of information seeking with STEM is that scientific discovery at its core is kind of founded in like seeking, creating, and disseminating information, right? You do hypothesis testing, you do all of these processes that are very structured and very rigorous. And to successfully create new information, you kind of have to have a basis of skills and knowledge that are built through learning foundational things. It's a running joke with any kind of anything that teaches science students that Bio 101 at any institution is fundamentally the same, right? And you're going to learn the same things generally. There may be slight deviations, but generally it's this very structured process around it. That said, STEM students often depend on Google as a first-line resource, and I think this is one of the really interesting things about working with students around information seeking and information literacy, is that in STEM, Google can absolutely be just as valid and good as traditional academic sources in STEM. Students just need to be critical of it. One of the things that students constantly tell me is, oh, we were doing a lab and I didn't know how to do it, so I found a YouTube video that explained it. And when I started in libraries, I kind of started looking at these videos and I was like, these are actually great. I was actually an instructor at the School of Pharmacy at Waterloo before I started at the library, and I would teach first year drug information, and students would look at it, they wouldn't understand something, they would go find a YouTube video, and I was kind of like, oh geez, what's in these YouTube videos? And it was great. And the thing is, the caution that I put with this is that it's not that STEM information online is incorrect, it's that it's correct enough and it's presented in a user-friendly way. And this is very much a double-edged sword. So students are going out and they're finding these resources, and it's correct enough, again, presented in a user-friendly, easy to understand way. But my kind of caution with it is it's hard for students to tell when they're learning what is good and bad information. And it's hard to teach them those kind of critique skills, how to be critical of information in a natural way when they are still building that foundational knowledge. And to me, that's one of the most interesting challenges about working with undergraduate STEM students, is we teach them this very structured approach to information seeking, right? Like, you can trust your professors, you can trust your textbooks, but the media is just blowing us all out of the water, right? The availability and access to information is just so astronomically high now, that we're competing against a torrent of information that is aimed at being palatable, that is aimed at being accessible, that is aimed at being easy to understand. Again, YouTube videos are a great example, but TikTok is also making a rise. And everybody always laughs at me when I say TikTok and STEM education. The STEM education going on TikTok is absolutely astounding. Like, the quality is so high. Sometimes, right? There's a lot of information out there. But when you look at a student getting overwhelmed by a textbook, and the comparator that they have in their head is just go watch a YouTube video, it'll explain it easier, YouTube will win every time, right? So the STEM context of information seeking is kind of shifting from the student perspective and the faculty perspective. I work very closely with a very senior professor at Waterloo, and I realized that I had lost the battle against Google Scholar when she's worked with me for years. She was one of my supervisors on my PhD. And I said something to her one day, and then she said, oh, well, the library catalog's just really confusing to use. And I think what's fascinating about the library catalog being hard to use is that in her head, it was easier. She had my cell phone number, she texted me all the time, right? But it was just easier mentally for her. And Jennifer, you made a comment in the chat that there's a lot of misinformation on TikTok. I'm not at all trying to diminish the fact that there's a ton of misinformation online. Everybody acknowledges that the amount of misinformation online is absolutely astronomical at this point, but there's a lot of good information on there, right? A lot of the information about vaccines that was emerging through TikTok was phenomenal. It was well presented, it was clear, it was done by experts who gave their credentials, right? And so I think that the kind of challenges we need to teach students how to navigate it, how to navigate what's easy, and just because it's easy doesn't make it right, but it can. Right? So our job has kind of shifted from this is the good information, this is the bad information with STEM information seeking, to what Carrie and I are talking about, which is this is how we're going to critique the information. Next slide. So I want to talk about being critical because this is one of those other fascinating terms that I find has a lot of loaded implications around it. So if you say you're critical of something, everybody always kind of has this very negative assumption with it. You're being critical, you're talking down about it, it's bad, whatever. So we kind of really intentionally chose critical for a few reasons. The primary reason is we wanted to link it to critical theory, as well as the critique process, which I'll talk a bit about. So we had kind of two terms that we wanted to link it. So critical theory looks at critiquing society and culture to uncover and break down power structures. So when we're talking about this, if you are constantly telling your students that the information they're seeking online is bad, right? A, that's a power structure. That's saying academic information is better than. But B, the other side of it is it does immediately devalue I always hate using the term alternative types of knowledge. So if anybody has a better term, please throw it in there. But what I'm thinking of is patient-centered knowledge, right? Indigenous knowledge and elders and expertise. These are two types of information that fall within the traditional boundaries of kind of academic, quote, quote, information. And it's really important that as we kind of navigate the new information landscape, we acknowledge that peer-reviewed isn't necessarily the best. It can be in a lot of ways, and I'm not trying to remotely knock the peer review process in kind of the value that it can bring. But what I'm trying to say is why should we expect patients or Indigenous elders to meet us where we are instead of trying to acknowledge that the information they bring is equally valued? And why aren't we teaching our students that different information contexts have different ways of critiquing it for appropriateness? And then the other one is a critique. And I don't know how many people here do come from kind of an engineering, arts, or architecture background, but critique is a very discipline specific process. I think a lot of different disciplines use it to varying degrees, but it's, and I'm oversimplifying this, if you are an expert in critique, I will fully contextualize that. But what critique is, it's a conversation. So what you do is you have your project or you have your piece of your project and you kind of present it to a group, right? Usually it includes a professor. It can just be your peers, your student peers, your student colleagues, or a TA. And what you do is you say, okay, so what I'm doing is I'm designing a new type of wheel or a new type of gear. And what I want to talk about is this specific design. And then you critique it as a group, right? So students will ask questions about like, well, why did you use this type of material for the gear? Why did you use this type of connector? How did you decide on the type, on the level of tension? And then you talk about it, right? So it's not telling you you're bad. It's asking why you made choices. It's asking if you thought about this other thing. It's asking like, well, why did you use a gear at all? And so I think that this idea of having a dialogue about the work you present is really translated well to information, and debatably incredibly impactfully. It's fundamentally what we do during a reference interview anyway, right? So when I started at U Waterloo, I started working with a professor in systems design engineering, and he had these design critiques. And I kind of started going to them and I started participating in them as a librarian. And, we were talking about it as a kind of conversation. I would kind of do the critique of like, well, how did you find the research to back this up? And I realized this really is just a reference interview, right? We're just not calling it a critique, right? And so when we started doing this process, I started having these mandatory consultations with the students where we went through the critique specifically. They would come to my office in the before pandemic times, and we would just talk about the sources they were using. And it was incredibly productive. It was things that they never thought about. They never thought about why they Googled a certain way. They would tell me they couldn't find something and I would say, okay, like, let's find it, right? And so these conversations around critique and framing our approach in the language they speak made it more accessible to them, right? It made it in their context and they understood it in a deeper way. Next slide.
So back to the library landscape. The ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education is really rooted in the idea of threshold concepts. And this is ostensibly what we should be teaching about information literacy. And threshold concepts have some underlying characteristics to them. And here are a few that are particularly important and we think actually align with what we are doing with CEI. So the first idea is that learning isn't a straight line linear process. It's something cyclical. You get new information, new learning, and that builds on past learning and feeds future learning. And this is actually one of the big things, is that threshold concepts are meant to be rooted or bounded in a specific discipline of study. because they're meant to be concepts that are particularly difficult to work with, and that change your frame of knowledge or reference for all future learning for the rest of time in that discipline. And they're meant to help students connect new learning to existing learning or aspects of knowledge that they've gained in that discipline. And once you have gained the understanding of a threshold concept, you can never lose it. It's something that's transformative for you, that is always with you and never lost. So we wanted to talk about this very briefly right now because part of how we are framing CEI is actually as a threshold concept for information literacy work within STEM disciplines. So thinking about taking it out of the LIS discipline and how we root this work within the disciplinary context and threshold concepts required for students in STEM. So next slide. So they're really important because they do help people understand and navigate information. It's not always clear what things are or aren't a threshold concept. Some people do think it oversimplifies disciplinary knowledge, and it's not clear exactly how they do work in multidisciplinary contexts. So I just want to be clear in talking about this very briefly that threshold concepts aren't necessarily an end-all or be-all, but they are really helpful in helping us reframe our thinking around how we can approach critical learning around information for students. So we can go to the next slide.
So real quickly about STEM pedagogies and information literacy, I touched on it with critique, but one of the things that is foundational to STEM is, again, many STEM students are building knowledge with the goal of having an option for pursuing a career where their professional information needs have an ethical component. And I mean, you can probably argue that any career has an ethical component, our lives have an ethical component. But in this case, I'm specifically thinking of people who work in health and engineers. Again, I think it's really interesting that health and engineering are undergraduate level education, right? And you're training very young adults in how to be a professional with very strong ethical boundaries around your career. So I teach the first year communications class for systems design engineering and biomedical engineering, and a mandatory part of my course is teaching them about ethics. So it's not just teaching them communication, I have to teach them about how to be an ethical engineer as well, right off the bat, starting in their first year. And then on top of this, librarians and instructors often have to navigate co-ops and work terms where they are getting this information from practitioners. And Waterloo is a co-op based school, so most of our students are in some form of co-op placement, not all, but most. And I know that many schools, I mean, at the very least, they have summers, students have summers off, and they're often trying to get kind of field specific jobs. And that means that they shift from getting information from kind of academic contexts and, you know, librarians, faculty, their instructors, their professors, and they shift to getting it from their coworkers, right, to their boss. And all of a sudden, you know, they're getting kind of this competing information. And I don't mean competing in an active way, but again, it's a passive way. The number of students who have told me explicitly, like, oh, well, we don't have access to those resources at my organization, so we just Googled it, and I was told to Google it. They were told to use Stack Overflow. They were told to use Reddit threads. They were told to use kind of internal, just informal knowledge, right? And so then how are they critical of that knowledge on top of it? And again, to reiterate, STEM information fundamentally is grounded in the knowledge that you have to understand the structure and the process of what you're learning and then scale that knowledge up, right? It's that iteration. And then on top of that, STEM students, and probably all students, are notoriously overconfident in their ability to find the right information to be successful. The number of times I have been sitting there with students and they're talking about their capstone project, and their capstone project at Waterloo is kind of the final big project that's the accumulation of their engineering degree or other programs too. And they're finding terrible resources and they're like, oh, it doesn't exist. And I'm like, but did you really look? You know, and they often didn't. And I don't blame them, right? They're very busy. They have so many different courses and deliverables and all of that due, right? And so you're trying to balance this overconfidence with this is good enough. This is good with those professional. We're trying to teach you to be ethical. We're trying to teach you to give you those grounding in ethics. Again, and then paired with being told in a professional context, oh, just Google it, right? So I think that when it comes to kind of STEM pedagogies and information literacy, we are balancing all of these external forces when it comes to the traditional ones. And then again, you can't forget that whenever you say information literacy to anyone in STEM, the kind of reaction is, well, I can read. And it's like, well, yes, but that's not really the point. But you're faced with that information literacy kind of stereotype in people's heads. And when you're pushing against a stereotype, it makes it really challenging for them to understand that why is it important that they learn to do this around information when they could just be memorizing another math formula that they need to pass an exam, or memorizing kind of how to code better so that they can impress their boss. Next slide. So again, what is our current practice? Moving into what we're actually doing after about half an hour. Our current practice is all of these things. So we are agile, we are flexible, it is STEM-centered, it is multidisciplinary, it is learner-focused, and it is information as a partner. And I think what's really important about this is the kind of agility and flexibility. When you're approaching students and faculty members, everybody has an agenda. And being as flexible as we can and kind of promoting that flexibility with people you're partnering to teach maybe a guest lecture, it's really important to have that flexibility for you, but also to kind of encourage them to be flexible in what they wanted. When I started doing this before Carrie got here, they told me, they were like, oh, can you come in and teach the students to just search the catalog and maybe do citations? And I was like, okay, so students won't listen to me if I do that. So what I want to do is turn it into this kind of conversation. And I hadn't fleshed anything out, but it worked really well. And again, part of that was the professor's willingness to like, let me be flexible. And, you know, I would always end my slide with some sort of my presentation, not slide, my slide deck, I guess, with this idea of like, okay, well, this is how you cite things well, and this is how you search the catalog, right? But it was really important to me that I not just do that. And then the other thing that I want to emphasize, they're all important around this, but multidisciplinarity is a huge thing at our institution, and I think at every institution now. And as we work into that, you're really trying to navigate a whole lot of different players in the game. And so understanding how to bring all of those kind of often disparate elements and perspectives in and unify them is a really key one about that, to try and navigate how do you get people to learn when you're not just learning one kind of siloed discipline specific knowledge anymore. Next slide, thanks.
So CEI, we're going to go into the process here in just a minute. But I would say overall, recognize that STEM students are at a place where we need to teach them to be critical, but they don't always have enough information or context to be able to do that within their discipline. They are transitioning from high school, where they were often the top students in their school, and moving into a context in higher education where they realize maybe they're not the best, maybe they're not an expert at everything, can be very hard for them. And it takes them some time to learn that knowledge and just learning in general is something that is very iterative. And threshold concepts, as we're presenting CEI, can align with that. So I think Kate is going to take the next slide. Or maybe I'll jump in real quick.
Nope, sorry, my cat hit my mute button.
Oh, okay. Fabulous.
I am notorious for having my cat ruin my life during presentations, and I thought I was free, but apparently the spacebar trapped me here. So CEI aligns with STEM-specific learning approaches. Again, the scientific method is about applying knowledge and hypothesis testing. And that's a version of what CEI is, right? When you're being critical, you're applying the knowledge and then you're hypothesis testing. Is this a piece of information good? Let's test it, right? And then again, the critique is about having a conversation. So you're not just hypothesis testing and applying knowledge, but you're really opening it up to a conversation. Next slide. So then we want to consider the needs of the learners, right? So STEM learners who are developing their information literate abilities, and this is a whole lot of words, but what we're really saying is that you need to examine your own biases, right? So we talk about this in the kind of conversation we have, which we'll get into, I think it's the next slide. They really reflect on why they're using a piece of information. Why did you choose this? What makes it good to you? Right? You understand that authority is constructed and build a deep understanding of the context, right? You want to find diverse perspectives. You don't just want to find ones that back up your opinion. And then you want to really critique it deeply, right? You want to understand why you're using it. And then again, most importantly, you want to understand that you're using this piece of information grounded under the ethical requirements of information, but any discipline you have has a version of ethical requirements, but you're kind of bound by humanities ethics, right? Let alone engineers and healthcare workers, healthcare professionals. So when you consider the needs of the learners and you take all of this into account, you really see that why it's so important that we kind of structure this idea of having a conversation around information, why we structure it as a conversation. Carrie?
Yeah, so I would say that's very true. And it also opens real opportunity to get in to the realities of their experience. When we come into a classroom and we say, you know, hi, I'm so-and-so librarian, and I'm here to talk about how to search the catalog or databases, we've already lost them, right? Because that's not the experience that they bring to the classroom with them. And so we have to take them from their experiences that they came to us with and help them transition into the knowledge and experiences with information and the approaches to information that they will need to be successful at university and transition into their professional lives. So we can go to the next slide.
So this is really what CEI is that we took a lot of things and we kind of put it all together. So it's a kind of a 4-step process where students' information seeking, evaluation, and use aligns with STEM-specific pedagogy, such as critique and the scientific method, to discuss and contextualize the source. So basically the 4 steps are: you define the context, you find a source, use any evaluative framework, and then you critique it or apply the scientific method to it. Right? We specifically bring in the fact that students have their own lived experiences and say that that is something you should acknowledge. One of my favorite parts of doing this in the classroom is I ask students every time, is bias good? Right? And everybody's gut reaction is like, nope, bias is bad. We should get rid of it. And I said, should we? Right? Because in a lot of cases, bias can be bad, but you are all biased about science right now, right? You're all biased that this is right. So how do we challenge that? How do we make sure we are truly right? How do we make sure that we're acknowledging our biases and working through them in a really impactful and meaningful way? And I think that what's really fun about this is that it turns it into a really deep conversation, which again mirrors the critique. And it really challenges students to ask the questions themselves, like we're there really as a facilitator. Right, Carrie?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of my best teaching experiences ever in my 15-year career was a couple of years ago when we were first implementing this method. And I had a class of chemical engineering students who had an exam they were all taking later in the day. And they came in and they were clearly exhausted and told me that they had this exam coming up. And I said, you know, we're just gonna talk today. We're gonna have a chat about some things that I'd love for you to think about. And, you know, if you're tired and you just need to put your head down, do it. And we had one of the best classes. And I stopped the class sort of partway through and said, hey guys, I thought we were really tired and worried about our exam today. And they said, yeah, but this is so engaging. Why hasn't anyone ever talked to us about this before? And those are the kinds of reactions that you can get when you align your teaching practice with what students actually have experienced and what they need with information seeking. And that's what CEI does. So we're going to go to the next slide. So in practice, we do typically do this in a 1-hour workshop, anywhere from 15 to 110 students. We give them a really brief background lecture where we talk a little bit about how ideas and hypotheses are generated, and the goal, and also where they actually find information. We tell them it's okay to Google, it's okay to use Reddit, it's okay to use social media, that all information is in fact just information. But after we do that, we talk to them about being critical, about bias. We help them by framing our conversation around a problem, and usually a problem that we've rooted in work. We ask them to read an article. Sometimes we have them find the article. Sometimes we provide it, depending on the amount of time that we have and the specific context. And then we give them a worksheet with our chosen evaluative framework and have them work through it, have them talk, tell them they should be loud, and then have a conversation about what that experience was like and what they discovered really thinking about it and applying approaches to being critical to that source that they were looking at. So it's really walking them through the sorts of things that as librarians we do every day, but giving them a framework in which to, and a process that they can apply. So we can go to the next slide. So this aligns with work integrated learning because they actually need to learn to do this. And students on work terms typically don't have access to library resources, especially aligned with licensing requirements. And also practitioners often don't use this. You know, Kate and I both are married to engineers, and I know I was talking to my husband who was looking for a European standard. His company doesn't have access to European standards, and so he had to do a bunch of Googling to find somebody who had written something about the standard, so that he could get the information he needed for price quoting. He didn't need to pay somebody for the actual standard. And also it's really important to think about information is used for a purpose, and the purpose in many STEM fields is about decision making. And you want to make sure that you're not helping your company make bad or erroneous decisions based on bad information, right? And it's not just what you look up on Google, it's your emailing, it's YouTube videos, it's chatting with coworkers, it's Netflix, it's social media. All of these places are places that you get information, but you have a responsibility to help yourself be critical of them. And you'll probably have to do that in a different way or apply slightly different standards to those sources of information than you do academic sources. So we're going to keep going.
So real quickly, we're running a bit tight on time, but we did want to say we did move CEI online during the pandemic. It works if you use a module-based approach. I'm sure it would also work if I did it once or twice as a guest lecture. It also does work. Students provided shockingly strong feedback about the modules, which really did surprise us. They love them. Instructors were also really excited to include them. They would every year. Usually I had to message people and be like, hey, it's this time again. Do you want this? And they would just be like, no, we want them. A kind of qualification, you do have to streamline the content quite significantly. And then our bias, as always, is we like in person better. Having a conversation is hard online. We've all sat through Zoom calls. And it's just kind of this wall of no camera on and students maybe multitasking. You can have discussion boards, but students have an easier time opening up when conversations aren't documented. And I think that's a big thing about this. We're asking students to be really vulnerable with their experiences, and to get that openness. It's way easier in class if you sit there and it's like, well, where do you find information? And they're like, oh, I always go online to the library catalog. And you're like, no, you don't. You go to Google. And they're like, how did you know? I do go to Google. And it's like, I go to Google too. And then you can have a much easier discussion. So just be aware of that. We are moving back to kind of a mixed approach, to my knowledge, at Waterloo, where some will be online on modules, and there will be back to in classroom. So I'm pretty excited to see where that goes next. Next slide.
So does this work? We have started to do assessment. Short answer is yes. By approaching it this way, you can actually see demonstrated improvements in students' ability to critique information. So, and we have a whole very lengthy paper about this that you're welcome to access. So I think we can move along.
So here's our kind of tips if you want to do it. I will also say we do have a slide deck that we can share if you send us an email that kind of gives our lesson plan for doing this. But here's some quick tips. Is boundaries help, right? We give students a case and we ask them to talk about it, be creative with the case, meet students where they are, speak the same disciplinary language. The one of these that I really want to emphasize is that it's okay to not know everything. Telling students it's okay to fail around information is huge right now. So many times people feel that if they found the wrong information, then it means they're wrong and that they should never, they should have never tried. And I think saying that, like, it's okay to be wrong, it's okay to learn more. Just because you thought a piece of information was good and you learned it was bad, doesn't make you less, right? It's a very important thing that you take this bad piece of information that you found and acknowledge it and move on and talk about what good information you found. So again, these are just some general tips, but that's my big one, is that acknowledge that you also make mistakes. What I tell students all the time, my favorite example with the pandemic is that, science learned more, right? That the thing is, when the pandemic started, everybody said, oh, well, it's a 2-dose vaccine, blah, 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 blah. And then it's not that that was wrong. Science just learned more, and now it's 3-dose with maybe boosters. And this is really big for students to hear this. For students to be able to hear that you can change your mind with information is massively important for them. Next slide. So these are our next steps. Test more. We want to complete kind of a more in-depth source analysis. We really want to build out our knowledge around what students are using in a really deep way. Build out the pedagogy itself, and then more deeply examine faculty perspectives. We have a lot of really good feedback from faculty. Most of it is colloquial. That said, the participation levels are pretty telling unto themselves, and being asked to come back. But we haven't really kind of done an analysis of faculty ones. And then I think our final slide, next slide. Yeah, so our final slide is that uptake is very strong. We honestly have somewhere between 80 and 95% of faculty members continue to participate for the past 5 years, which is astronomical. The principles of this hold true across any discipline. So we focus on STEM, and I want to be very clear that we are focused on STEM. That's because that's where I am situated. Carrie and I work in that. Carrie also does some work with it outside of STEM, but this is really focused on STEM. Largely, it's a language issue. Remember that. Relationship building is huge. The number of times I went out for coffee with faculty members, we just chatted. That was huge. And I think one of the big things Carrie and I do want to flag is misinformation is dominating the landscape. I know we are kind of preaching to the choir right now. That is very commonly known by everybody who works in a library. But it's so important we teach students to critique all information. It's just pervasive now. Carrie, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's it, especially since we get very excited and we were talking too long. So we'd love to answer some of your questions.
We can go to the final slide, which is just questions in our email contact info. Does anybody have any questions?
So awesome. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. Just to reiterate to folks, we will give people a minute to get their questions into chat before we wrap up and sign off for today. I did want to reiterate today's presentation was recorded. We will be sharing all of this, your great references here, as well as the very helpful references around reparations in your opening slide. Those are fantastic resources to dig into as well. As people are perhaps putting things into chat, I will ask a question, revealing my own ignorance, but I feel safe doing that with you guys. What do you mean, don't search the entire internet?
So that's one of the one of the big things I get with people, with students. You know what? It's not just students; it's everybody I talk to. I give community presentations on this too, and there's this really deep misunderstanding of how things kind of get organized on Google. Like, why are the top results at the top, right? And so, that's an algorithm that's based on number of clicks, all of this stuff. But there's this assumption with that if you go a bit further down the list, right, you'll get better, quote, quote, better results, right? And like, that's all that is you don't have to go down 10, 20 pages to find the right results. You just have to understand that it's based on the number of clicks, which means that it's either the question that you're asking, if it's very technical, it might be too technical for you. And if it's too it might be a bit too easy to understand, depending on if you need more technical. There's a bunch of questions. So yes, we will be sharing the slides. Rebecca?
So I think that question might be the slide deck that you referenced about the roadmap for implementation. And I think you said if people email you, you can send that.
Yeah, we will.
Them.
If you just send us an email, we'll send it to you. Do you still teach the basics, like searching the catalog or a certain database, or have you moved away from that completely? It depends, Katrin. Generally in this class, we don't. I will say we don't. And that's because in my experience, I should also qualify that we are mostly teaching this class to first year students. And my experience is that most first year students don't really need to use the catalog. A lot of what they're doing is textbook based. They don't have the knowledge to understand journal articles yet. So we usually, I will say that with my classes, I come back, I'm very embedded in my faculty. So I do come back and teach them how to search the catalog or a database, usually in third, fourth year. I haven't moved away from it completely, but I have moved away from it a lot. We're also very fortunate that students reach out a lot after this. Our uptake of students coming to us after these presentations did go up a bit, first year students. And so I think that depends. If there's a professor who is very specifically wants us to teach searching the catalog or a database, we absolutely do. So like, it's not like I'm refusing to teach the catalog. Carrie, I think it's the same with you.
Yeah, we focus on it a little more in the approach that we use in the arts to doing this, simply because some of those library-based, especially book sources, are important there in comparison to in STEM, where they have less prominence, because the information tends to get old more quickly. But in general, no, we try not to teach that if we can avoid it. It's always a negotiation with the faculty member. But yeah, and we really frame it more as like databases, catalogs, these are things that exist. And when you need more specialized information later in your undergraduate career, or maybe if you go into graduate school, like, come talk to us and we'll talk to you more about those things. But the idea is that information from the library, it exists, but that's one place that you can get information.
Yeah.
Right. And what we're trying to do is help them take their experience of finding information and transition into the academic environment in a way that feels authentic and aligns with what they're learning in their STEM courses.
Yeah. And then there's another question from Mark, is talking about sources that could complement the source you're evaluating part of the approach. I like to try and encourage students to consult more than one perspective, interested in your language to encourage that. Mark, absolutely. So we do. So what we do as part of this is we kind of give them a case, right? So we go to the classroom and say, okay, pretend that you're a student on co-op at this company and you were asked to make a decision about if the company should implement wearable fitness trackers, something like that. And basically we give them an article and then we say critique it. And we largely use Radar. I know that there's some kind of contentiousness about Radar. To be honest, I find it the one that the students respond best to. So I'm not saying it's the best. I know there are other ones that are debatably better, but it's kind of our default. And then we always say, like, can you get all the information from this source? Did you need to Google it? Where else did you find information? So it is a big thing to encourage them to consult it. And I do it I try and do it in a natural way, if that makes sense. So what I try and do is I try and say, could you find all of the information in this one article? Did you check any of the sources that this article cited? Did you have to Google to make sure it was right? What other sources did you use? And then, to be blunt, part of the big thing that I try is this, I don't want to call it like radical honesty, but honesty is I tell them that we used to have something called the rule of three, right? If you found the same information from 3 different places, probably it's good. That rule doesn't really work with the way that misinformation and information is being handled on the internet, because you can find any information. You can find flat earth compared in 3 different places now, right? That seem to be different, that, you know, may or may not be different, but that seem to be different. So what we really try and do is turn it into a dialogue. Like, would you base a decision based on just one person's opinion, right? Even just one document. Like, is that enough for you to make a decision on? If you're trying to guide company policy, would you only use one document? What if you're wrong? Right? You're going to have to stand up to your boss and explain why you didn't look a bit more into it. Right? And so I really just encourage them to be natural in their thinking. I think very rarely do people naturally just find information in one space. And I say this where I know that there can be echo chambers. I understand that we all fall into echo chambers to some extent, but even our echo chambers do tend to have different ones, right? The other thing I do is I tell them you never get information from one place. You talk to friends, family, professors, you go on the internet, right? So you're starting to really kind of approach this holistically. I hope that helps them. Carrie,
Yeah.
anything.
And I would say the other thing is that we really try to stress to them, thinking about bias, that one of the things that they're bringing to this is their own background and experiences and perspectives, right? So even if they're only looking at one piece of information, they're coming to that piece of information with additional information from their own background and experience. And that's important, but that's going to color everything as well. And that the people who are writing the information that they're looking at are also people, and their own background and experiences color what they're reading and putting out there. So, you know, information comes from people, and all people have bias. So all information has bias. It's just a matter of what that bias is and how are you working through it.
And I think it's okay to tell them, right? Like, what I always tell my students is I always tell them that I am absolutely biased. I am biased for science. And right now, there is nothing you can tell me that would make me think vaccines cause autism, right? Like, that's my bias. My bias is based on my scientific knowledge, my scientific background, my background in pharmacy, right? But I tell them that, like, this is my bias. And when I say nothing can change that, if there was a series of papers that I felt met the kind of academic rigor and standards of it that said, okay, maybe it does not. I want to be very clear. This is not what I'm saying. I'm using just an example. But I tell them, right? So what I encourage them is to kind of explore, challenge their biases. I do look at research that I don't agree with, right? And you examine it. So Jennifer, would you be willing to share your worksheet? Like, yes, we'll share the slide decks happily if you email us. You like it. Thanks, Mark. Jennifer, we'll absolutely be willing to share it. I will tell you that literally our worksheet that we hand out alongside our slide deck is just a printed off article. And then we literally just do radar. Like, we literally take the radar, like RADAR, put it in a worksheet and have them work through that as a worksheet. So it's meant to work with whatever one you work with, whatever one your faculty works with, whichever one you like. It doesn't matter. You just kind of sub it in. You ask them to use it as a ground for critique. It kind of guides their thinking. Make up your own, right? You could probably do it with just like, write your opinion on this, write what other sources you use. This is meant to be really flexible. It's meant to work with what you have. So we have used it with a bunch of different ones. Carrie, what was the other one we used that wasn't radar? I hate crap, so I will never use crap. But what was the other one
We've
we
used PATS. We've
Yeah,
used
that's
this. I've used the stoplight model, which I co-created a few years ago. It doesn't matter. Anything that people like for evaluation. Anything that speaks to you that you feel comfortable using, use
Yeah.
that.
Critical appraisal has very structured ones. If anybody in
Yeah.
here, I don't know if anybody is a health librarian. Critical appraisal is kind of what health librarianship really does lean on pretty heavily. So I've used critical appraisal with it, like the critical appraisal tenants.
Yeah, the one caution about critical appraisal is just it assumes that people have a certain level of like disciplinary background knowledge.
It's not one I would work with unless
Yeah.
they're in health, because in
Yeah.
health it's in health it's a very known approach, right? And so it's yeah. I don't see any other questions.
Yeah, and we are actually a couple minutes over, but
Sorry.
very grateful to you guys for sharing this your great information and for having us think about some slightly different ways to approach and improve our practices. Thank you, Mark. I agree. This was a great presentation, and really also enjoyed the Q&A portion. We will be emailing you when the recording is available with a link to the slides, and of course, sharing Kate and Carrie's contact information in case you didn't happen to get that the first time around, and you can contact them for more details. So thank you so much for turning out today, and this concludes today's webinar.